Everyone knows what Spain took out of the Americas. Silver in quantities so vast that the price of money shifted across 3 continents. Second on the customs list, year after year, was a sack of dried insects. Not a figure of speech, small gray pellets dusty as gravel packed in his leather bags and shipped by the ton out of Veracruz. Crush one between your fingers and the finger goes crimson. Just the one insect. In Seville, they were weighed, taxed, and auctioned like bullion. And for roughly 3 centuries, they were the most valuable processed good the Spanish Empire carried home from Mexico. Europe was not short of red before that. It is worth saying so plainly because this story usually gets told as though the continent had been living in beige. Madder, the root of a common plant, had been dyeing cloth since antiquity and gave good brick and rust and rose tones cheaply in almost any climate that would grow it. Kermes, a scale insect from Mediterranean oaks, gave the deep crimson of cardinals and coronation robes and cost accordingly. Brazil wood gave a bright red that faded, which everyone knew and used anyway. One more red should have been a minor entry in a shipping ledger. It was not. The reason it was not comes down to a single measurable property, and the claim in the title stands or falls on it. Cochineal did not beat every other red at everything. Madder stayed the workhorse for centuries afterwards and never went away. And it is madder, not cochineal, in most of the ordinary red cloth of the period. What cochineal won on was concentration. How much color comes out of a given weight of raw material. The insect is Dactylopius cactus. The females are wingless, about 5 millimeters long, and spend their short lives fixed to the pads of prickly pear cactus, drinking sap under a coat of white wax that makes an infested pad look like it has been snowed on. Inside that unremarkable body sits carminic acid, which the insect seems to make as a defense, since it tastes appalling to ants. In dried Dactylopius cactus, carminic acid runs to something like a fifth of the body weight. The old world cochineals, the Polish and the Armenian, come in under 1%. Kermes sits in the same low range. That gap is everything. That is the entire engine of the story. Dyers who switched found the American insect went roughly 10 times further than Kermes for the same weight, though the exact multiplier moves around depending on which analysis you read and which shade you are chasing. 10 to 12 is the figure that turns up most often in the trade histories. I would treat any single number here as a claim about one experiment rather than a constant of nature. The dye also needs help to stay put. Wool goes into a bath with a mordant first, usually alum, a mineral salt that grips the fiber at one end and the dye molecule at the other. Change the mordant, change the color, same bug, different bath. Alum gives crimson, tin gives that shrieking scarlet, iron drags everything towards a purple brown. Painters use the same insect a third way, precipitating the dye onto a chalky powder to make what is called a lake, a pigment for glazing. Rembrandt used it in glazes. Turner used it, and some of those late Turner reds have quietly drained out of the paper since, because the beauty of a color and the survival of it were never the same property. In Nahuatl, the dye was nochesli, cactus blood, from the words for cactus and for blood. There is still a town north of Oaxaca City called Nochislan, place of cactus blood, which is about as direct a piece of economic geography as a name can carry. None of this was new when the Spanish arrived, not remotely. Weavers across Mesoamerica had been raising cochineal on cactus for a very long time, and the Aztec state taxed it. The Codex Mendoza, an imperial tribute record compiled in the 16th centuries from earlier lists, sets out what conquered provinces owed. The Mixtec city of Coistlahuasa, taken in the 1450s, owed blankets, warrior costumes, greenstone beads, bunches of green feathers, gold dust, and 40 bags of cochineal a year. A tribute list is a blunt instrument, but it tells you what an empire thought was worth hauling uphill. Picture the work behind those 40 bags. a grove of nopal cactus on a dry Oaxacan hillside, planted in rows, each pad seeded by hand with pregnant females carried out in small nests of moss or husk. The insects settle, feed, and breed, and the grower's job for the next 3 or 4 months is keeping them alive, brushing off predators, propping mats over the pads against hard rain, because a downpour can strip a season's work off a plant in an afternoon. Then, the harvest, done with a brush made from a deer's tail, worked gently down each pad so the bodies drop into a bowl without bursting. Slowly, always slowly. Then, the killing, which is where the real craft sits, because how you kill them decides the color you get. Sun-dried gives one shade, dropped into hot water gives another, baked over the fire on a comal gives a third, and a buyer could tell the difference and price it. The yield is the part that stops people. A pound of dried cochineal is somewhere on the order of 70,000 insects. Published figures vary quite a lot, and they should, since insects vary in size, and the drying method changes the weight. But the order of magnitude is not in dispute. Tens of thousands of individually harvested animals for 1 pound of powder. Mexico was not the only place doing this. Cochineal turns up in Andean textiles centuries before any Spanish ship arrived, and analysts working on Peruvian cloth from the Huari and Tiahuanaco periods, roughly the 7th to the 12th century, keep finding carminic acid in the reds and pinks. 2 American regions, the same insect, the same slow business of tending it. The trade also learned to grade. Grana fina meant the farmed insect plump with dye. Wild cochineal off untended cactus was a different and much weaker product, and it sold as such, which tells you the market could taste the difference between an animal that had been farmed and one that had merely been found. That powder crossed the Atlantic from the 1520s onward, and Europe lost its head over it. By the last decades of the 16th century, cochineal exports from New Spain averaged around 550,000 pesos a year. The historian Raymond Lee, working through the Seville trade records, put that at close to 9% of the value of the silver, moving the same direction. 9% sounds modest until you remember what it is 9% of, and that it was produced by indigenous households on small hillside plots, in bags a man could lift. Prices were quoted on the exchanges in Amsterdam and London. English privateers went out of their way to take cochineal ships, and when a Spanish vessel went down in 1541 off the Texas coast, part of her cargo was 20,000 pounds of the stuff. English dyers had their own word for it. Cloth dyed with these insect reds was dyed in grain from grana, and that phrase is where our word ingrained is usually traced from. A color that has gone all the way in and will not come out. The etymology is the standard one rather than a proven one, but the dyeing sense is certainly older than the metaphor. And almost nobody in Europe knew what they were buying. This is the strange middle of the story. The Spanish crown banned the export of live insects, restricted travel into the growing regions, and let a useful confusion stand. Grana means grain, seed, which is what most European buyers assumed the pellets to be. Some dried fruit or seed of a foreign plant. Others were sure it was a worm bred out of rotting berries. The argument ran for well over a century, seriously, among serious people. In 1685, the chemist Robert Boyle sent grains of cochineal to Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the finest microscopist alive, and asked what they were. Leeuwenhoek looked and said, "Seeds." He was wrong. Boyle took his word for it anyway. Nicholas Hartsoker published the first clear depiction of the animal in 1694. Leeuwenhoek came back to the question and published his own illustrations of the insect in the Philosophical Transactions in 1704, and plenty of readers still would not have it. The matter was finally closed in the 1720s by a Dutch merchant named Melchior de Ruyter, who had a wager riding on it, and who won by assembling sworn testimony and documents from the producers in Oaxaca. The definitive proof of what cochineal was did not come out of a lens. It came from asking the farmers. Hold on to that, because it is where this ends up. Meanwhile, the dye had become the base of a whole European craft economy. In Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, the Crutchley family ran scarlet dyehouses for generations, and 9 of their working books survive, thick with snipped patterns of dyed wool and handwritten instructions. Cochineal with alum. Cochineal with tin spirits made up with nitric acid for the loud scarlets. Brazil wood or logwood added to shade a batch down cheaply. Those books were trade secrets. Reading them now, we can watch a dyer chase one shade across a dozen attempts, adjusting the water source, the timing, the order of the baths. The insect was only ever half of the product. The other half was a man in an apron who knew what tin did. The color that came out of those vats is one most of us have seen without knowing what we were looking at. British soldiers wore red for 2.5 centuries, and the ordinary infantryman's coat was dyed with madder, the cheap plant red. Officers and sergeants wore the brighter scarlet, and that one was Cochineal. Same regiment, same parade ground, 2 different dyes, and anyone could read a man's rank at 50 paces by how loud his coat was. Scarlet was only extended to all ranks in 1873, by which point the price had collapsed for reasons that had nothing to do with the army. One thing that never happened is the thing you would expect. Cochineal never became a plantation crop. Sugar, tobacco, indigo, all of those got reorganized into large estates worked by enslaved labor. Cochineal stayed in the hands of indigenous smallholders in Oaxaca for the whole colonial period because the work is fiddly, seasonal, and impossible to supervise at scale. What grew up around it instead was a credit system called the Repartimiento de Mercancías, in which the local Spanish magistrate advanced money or goods to a village against a future delivery of dye at a price fixed in advance. Historians argue hard about what that system actually was. The older reading, and it has plenty of evidence behind it, treats it as straightforward coercion, a way of forcing production and locking growers into debt. Jeremy Basks has argued the opposite case, that the magistrates were supplying credit nobody else could enforce across that cultural and legal gap, and that growers took it because they wanted the income. I lean towards the reading that keeps both halves, a real service, offered on terms only one side could set. What is not in dispute is that when the price collapsed, it was those households, not the magistrates, who lost everything. So why did nobody simply steal the insect and grow it somewhere else? Plenty tried. The one who got closest was a French botanist called Nicolas Joseph Thierry de Menonville. In 1777, he sailed for Mexico with his government's blessing and a cover story about hunting plants to treat gout. His passport was taken at Veracruz, and he was ordered onto the next ship out. Instead, he put it about that he would be spending the interval at the country estate of a widow, went over the city wall at night, and set off on foot for Oaxaca without knowing the road, talking directions out of monks by claiming he had sworn a religious vow. In Oaxaca, he learned the cultivation from indigenous growers, bought infested cactus pads, and got them back alive to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where he raised them successfully. Then he died in 1780, 3 years later. The plantation died with him, and his manual on nopal and cochineal was published in 1787 after his death. There is something genuinely unresolved sitting underneath all of this, and it is the beginning rather than the end. Farmed Dactylopius caucus cannot really survive without people. It is softer bodied than its wild relatives, carries far more dye, and needs human tending to get through weather that would otherwise wipe it out. That is the signature of a domesticated animal, and it implies a long history of selection in Oaxaca and in the Andes. How long is not settled. Estimates run to 2,000 years and beyond, and the evidence is a scatter of dyed textiles, later colonial documents, and inference from the insect's own biology, rather than anything as clean as a dated excavation. I find the biological argument the stronger of the two. But it is an argument, not a measurement, and anyone offering a confident founding date is rounding. Now, the turn. For 2 centuries, Europe treated cochineal as a natural mystery, to be cracked with lenses and expeditions and nerve. It was never a mystery. Not there. In Oaxaca, it was a crop with a season and a brush and a known price, understood by thousands of ordinary households. What Europe was actually up against was not nature. It was a monopoly, plus a distance, plus a state, with every reason to let a lie about seeds stand. The scarcity was manufactured. Prickly pear grows in any warm, dry place that will have it, and the Spanish knew that better than anyone, which is exactly why live insects were not allowed to leave. When the thing finally broke, it did not break because a spy got through. It broke in a laboratory. In 1868, the German chemists Karl Graebe and Karl Liebermann worked out how to synthesize alizarin, the coloring compound of madder root, from coal tar. The commercial patents followed the next June, with William Perkin filing in Britain one day ahead of the German team, and the madder trade was finished inside a few years. Cochineal took slightly longer, killed off by the generation of cheap aniline and azo reds that came after alizarin rather than by alizarin itself. But by the 1880s, the market was gone. The timing was almost cruel. Growers in the Canary Islands had spent the middle of the century scaling up until they were producing something like 5 million pounds a year, more than Mexico and Guatemala together, and they scaled straight into the crash. Oaxacan production nearly vanished, a whole regional economy gone in a generation. The most valuable non-metal export of a colonial empire became a curiosity in about 15 years, and no amount of secrecy could have delayed it, because chemistry does not have to be smuggled over a wall at Veracruz. The insect is back, though, quietly. It came back through fear of synthetic food dyes, which sent manufacturers hunting for color they could label natural, and Cochineal was waiting. Peru is the largest producer now, with Mexico, Chile, and the Canaries behind it. On a European label, it shows up as E120 or carmine or cochineal extract, and sometimes it hides inside the phrase natural color. It is in lipsticks and blushers. It is in some yogurts, sausages, sweets, fruit drinks, and cocktail bitters. For anyone vegetarian or vegan or keeping halal or kosher, that matters a great deal, and it is why the labeling rules exist at all. For a long stretch, nobody was told, and when people found out, there were arguments. In Oaxaca itself, the revival looks different. Weaving towns in the Central Valleys, Teotitlan del Valle among them, went back to Cochineal as buyers started paying for naturally dyed rugs and cloth. And the Textile Museum of Oaxaca has spent years tracking down the remaining growers, recording how each of them raises and kills the insects, and testing the resulting dye for light fastness against the historical recipes, which is a strange kind of ending. The knowledge that Europe could not extract by espionage for 200 years is now being documented carefully by a museum because it came close enough to disappearing to need saving. The economics have turned completely inside out. Cochineal was once the color of cardinals and generals, the red you wore to prove you could afford it. It is now a commodity food additive priced against synthetics, still produced by hand-picking insects off spiny pads in the sun, because nobody has managed to automate that. The dye never changed. The world around it changed twice. Next time something in your kitchen is implausibly red, a strawberry yogurt, a raspberry drink, a lipstick on the shelf, turn it over and read the ingredients to the end. If it says carmine or E120, you are holding the thing Spain hid behind a lie about seeds, that a Frenchman went over a city wall for, and that a Dutch merchant finally proved the nature of by writing to farmers in Oaxaca